Greetings fellow word lovers, Heavy Metal Bookworm here. Happy New Year to you and all that bollocks. Sorry I've been away, I've been too busy being all Christmassy and shit, but I'm back and first of all I'm going to start by apologising to any Russian speakers in the audience because this week I'm going to be talking to you about We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. I think I got that right, sorry. Okay, the book was first published in 1924 and is said to be a big influence on the likes of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and George Orwell's 1984. It's actually touted as one of the first dystopian novels, so it intrigued me off the bat. I hadn't heard of it until I picked it up some while back, but I was quite intrigued by it based purely on its influence and dystopian and anti-utopian stories. So We is set in 26th century AD in a place called One State, which is a hive-minded sort of totalitarian, dystopian or anti-utopian society. In this society, in this future, people do regard things like human emotion and spirituality as somewhat illogical and therefore quite primitive. Instead, they favour a more regimented society, again with the hive mind state. So they look up to things like the purity of numbers and things like maths and the times table. All this is overseen by someone called the benefactor, who in turn has his own sort of secret police known as guardians who keep a 24-hour watch on everybody. So already you're getting some sort of Orwellian sort of vibes to it, or at least I did anyway when I first read what the story was about. So the story actually follows a protagonist known as D503. I need to mention at this point that people in this society, people in One State, don't actually have names. They have numbers and letters assigned to them. I don't quite know whether there's a logical sort of ordering to it or whether it's arbitrary. But yeah, they don't have names. They just have these assigned numbers and letters. So D503 is a rocket engineer working on a project known as the Integral, which is a rocket set to be fired off into space so they can colonise other planets. So the novel's told in a kind of diary format by D503, who sort of puts his thoughts down on paper. Now, initially he's very content with society. He's happy being part of a sort of almost a cog in a big machine. I don't know if that's the term, but he's happy being a part of something bigger than himself. He has his job, which he finds important and is beneficial to society, and he has sort of a government or sort of state-appointed sort of sexual partner. And in actual fact, D503 is not only happy in society, but he's actually he feels sorry for people who came before him, the people who sort of in our generation, who he refers to as the ancients, people who had religion and who had emotional reactions to poetry and music rather than sort of logical reactions to it. But as the story progresses, he happens upon a woman known as I-330. She introduces him to a new way of life, much against his will, really. She smokes, she drinks, she flirts, and despite him fighting against it, he becomes intrigued by her until he eventually becomes infatuated with her and he begins to meet up with her. Now, there is a part in which they meet up in an ancient building. And when I say ancient building, I mean a standard, traditional, what you and me know as a bricks and mortar building, because in One State, all buildings are made entirely out of glass, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, entirely made out of glass, so there's a 24-hour constant surveillance on society, which they're happy with. They like the idea of being watched and being monitored and feeling protected. But this building is kind of like it's an abandoned building from ancient times in which D503 and I-330 meet up and engage in these sort of debauched acts. He first tries alcohol, I believe he also smokes, but then what transgresses is this kind of change or this shift in his mental state. He sort of finds himself becoming a little bit more emotional, a bit irrational. And in One State, in this society anyway, having a soul is deemed a mental illness, so he's convinced entirely that he has a medical condition rather than he has some sort of personality trait or some part of him that's changing and seeing society in a different way. He fights against it, but he's too intrigued by it, and over the course of the story he's got kind of this internal conflict with himself. On the one hand, he likes his job, he likes the part he plays in society, but he's also becoming a little bit disenfranchised with one state and with the benefactor, and also with the Guardians. I also noticed as well, I'm not quite sure why this is, but there's a lot of references to faces. D503, obviously everything's told from his perspective, so everything's seen through his eyes from his diary pages. But there's a lot of references to faces in sort of detail, and the way he describes it is quite sort of telling of his, perhaps his changing personality. And I'm trying to work out why there's so much references to it, and I think it's because in this kind of society in which logic, reason, shape, form, numbers, timetable are sort of seen as a higher power, the human face with its kind of irregularities and imperfections and its bizarre shape and its unique shape throughout, to someone like D503 who's having this change in personality after being introduced to this sort of debauched way of life, can you imagine to him the human face, the eyes, mouth, lips, being somewhat intriguing to a person who's used to sort of I don't know if Euclidean geometry is the right phrase, but sort of standard regimented geometry, shapes and all that. So the human face would be quite intriguing to him, I'd imagine. Okay, so despite its influence on Orwell and Huxley novels, I found We to be a little bit slow. It's only 225 pages long, but I found it a little bit sludgy in places. D503, obviously we're sort of seeing everything from his perspective. We get to sort of internalise his own sort of what he thinks of his toxic thoughts. But he seems to brood a lot about society and about the people around him and about his work and the past and the future and all that. There's a certain sort of melancholy about it, and it doesn't quite pull me in. It kind of feels more of a struggle to actually read it, despite the fact it's not immensely long. There's also a lot of drifting off of thoughts, and again, I'm not entirely sure whether that's something to do with the translation or whether it's something to do with, because it's not just the main character who does it. He goes from sort of like, it's told in a very sort of, what's the phrase? Stream of conscious. That's probably the best way to describe it. It's very sort of stream of conscious. He's obviously writing it in diary format, so you can imagine he's just scribbling down his thoughts, and some of it comes across as nonsensical, a little bit abstract, but there's also a lot of instances in which characters don't finish their sentences, sort of drift off from their own thoughts, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. It doesn't seem to add anything to the story, it just leaves all the questions open, sort of, what was they going to say? What was the meaning of that? And it doesn't quite gel with the story. Probably the most intriguing thing about this novel is not necessarily the story itself or the prose, but more the sort of history behind it. So I'm going to try. Zamyatin, the author, he wrote this as a sort of biting satire on Stalin's Russia, which he was living in at the time. And as a piece of satire, it works really, really well, especially if you know even a little bit about what Russia must have been like back in the, well, I suppose in the 20s. I would imagine some of you are probably thinking of Animal Farm as well. I would imagine this book might have had some influence on that. So as a sort of analysis of that society, it's very interesting. But as a piece of prose, as an actual story, as a narrative, it's sad to say. I know it's one of the first of its kind, and it's left an imprint on dystopian literature. Stop getting things wrong. As it's left its mark on those types of novels, you'd think it would. It deserves some sort of credit, obviously, but it's sad to say, but unfortunately it's true that it has been done a lot better. The two books by my side have just taken that nugget of the dystopian idea and just spread it out and made it much more interesting, intriguing, and a little bit more, I would say, relevant to society. This doesn't feel relevant. I don't know why. I think it's because especially George Orwell's 1984 is set in a society we can believe in, even though it is technically in the future. This is so far in the future that he's classed as a dystopian novel, but it does also come across as very, very sci-fi. So it's very difficult to sort of connect with the characters because they live so far over the future. If it didn't have a year, if it wasn't set in a specific time period, you could probably imagine that this is like society in a recent future, or society now, but in an alternate timeline. But as such, it doesn't quite click with me. It might do with other people, but it doesn't quite click with me. So, as I said, yeah, it's important. I think it's an important novel. It's like listening to Megadeth. You can see it there. Being a fan of Megadeth, Metallica, Slayer, all that, and then going back further along and seeing what influenced them, and then what's influenced those people, and then going right back to, I suppose you've got right back to the blues really, and listening to that, and just sort of not necessarily being entrenched by it. Entrenched? That's not the right word. Not necessarily being intrigued by it, not necessarily finding it to your taste, but at least understanding the influence it had on the stuff that you're interested in. I think that's kind of how I would sum this up. It's not a great story. It's not well told, I don't think. I think it drags and it feels sludgy. But you can definitely see where George Orwell and Huxley pick up the important parts of it and make it their own, and I think they do it much, much better. But as a piece of satire, if you're interested in Russian politics, Russian history, that's your bag, then maybe this might be something that you might want to read. But I would urge people to at least try it, because of the influence of that. I don't keep going on about that, but it is said to be one of the first of its kind, so I think it's important to at least check it out. I'll let you in on a little secret actually. I've not actually finished this book. I've actually been at it for a while now, and I'm reading it a couple of chapters at a time, and I'm just not, it's not pulling me in at all. And I don't know whether that's just the fault of the translation, whether I've had too high hopes for it because of the works that came after it, but it's not really working. It's not really working for me. I probably will try and finish it before I move on to my next book, but it's beginning to sort of drag a little. It's beginning to just feel like a chore, and I don't want it to be a chore. But anyway, that's all from me. I believe I have rambled on quite a lot. As always, let me know what you think in the comments down below, and give me any suggestions. I always love to hear them. But for now, stay metal, my friends, and happy 2016.